dry ice is produced from CO2. So it's inescapably tied to the broader CO2 market. What happens to the CO2 market definitely affects dry ice. When I mentioned earlier that CO2 supply has only been growing at about 0.5% per year, that just doesn't bode well for dry ice, which has been growing closer to 5% per year. And I should note too that dry ice consumes about 18% of the available CO2. And that's because when you have recycling, it still takes about 1.5 pounds of CO2 to make just 1 pound of dry ice. And many of the other dry ice producers with the pelletizers, they don't have recycle because their volumes don't justify the expense. So for them, it takes about 2.5 pounds of CO2 to make 1 pound of dry ice. So it takes a lot of CO2 to make dry ice. So dry ice growth is dependent on the CO2 market. And your point about the regulatory environment that's affecting the overall CO2 market, it's of great concern here in the US and I'm sure offshore, and the dry ice market by extension from that. This is because those US incentives to reduce carbon emissions will impact future CO2 supply and the market's ability to grow, and therefore dry ice's ability to grow. We need to see how this all falls out. But the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture sequestration, was raised by the Inflation Reduction Act to $85 a ton. And the recent One Big Beautiful Bill raised the credit to $85 a ton for carbon capture utilization to bring parity with sequestration. So we need to see how this all flushes out. But, we've watched over the past, few years, how a number of CO2 crude producers that currently sell into the merchant CO2 market have signed on to some of these proposed sequestration pipelines. Now, some have gone away, but some are still out there. In addition, there are other companies that are planning to sequester their CO2, into geological formations beneath their plants using that Class 6 well permitting process. So for now, my current tabulation shows this will all take about 1,400 tons a day of CO2 supply out of the market in the longer term if all of these plans come to fruition, and some of them will. There are not enough projects that I know about on the drawing board to make up for this loss in supply. I would also like to note that CO2 supply will be, losing 3 plants in California between later this year and April of 2026 in the hydrogen space. This just doesn't bode well, for CO2 supply and therefore dry ice. The CO2 and dry ice markets will need more supply or growth just can't happen. And at the rate we're going, demand will shrink with supply. But, on a more positive note, there are a number of companies out there that are currently planning or they're in the process of installing CO2 recovery from sustainable sources, like building decarbonation, biogenic waste from food, dairy, or landfill. There's carbonate fuel cell generation, direct air capture, and vehicle or rail decarbonization. We actually do have several projects that are already running right now that are sustainable sources in the US. But these sources, they tend to be smaller, but if we can get enough of them, it could help make up for some of that loss. And these projects, they were driven to pursue these new sources because of the loss of sourcing because of decarbonization. So we'll have to wait and see what happens.